Have you ever imagined that an invisible enemy could bring down entire empires, change the fate of kings, and even redraw the world's borders? Well, some of history's greatest turning points weren't caused by armies or powerful weapons, but by something microscopic: mysterious diseases, epidemics that appeared out of nowhere, spread like wildfire, and left a trail of chaos and transformation in their wake. Today, we're diving into astonishing cases where a single disease completely altered the course of humanity. Get ready, because each story is more surprising than the last. But first, think about this. What's more terrifying? Facing an enemy you can see, like an army armed to the teeth, or fighting something invisible, silent, that could be in the water you drink, the air you breathe, or a simple handshake. And we're not just talking about tragedies. Many of these diseases opened doors to unexpected changes, scientific revolutions, social transformations, and even medical advances we still rely on today. It's as if each microbe wrote entire chapters of our history with invisible ink. In today's video, you'll discover plagues that shook civilizations, kings who lost their crowns to mysterious fevers, and even wars won not by the strongest, but by the most resilient. It sounds like science fiction, but it really happened. To kick off this journey, let's go back to one of the darkest moments of the Middle Ages. Imagine waking up in a small medieval European village and discovering that half your neighbors have simply vanished overnight. Not because they left, but because they were taken by a horrific disease. That's how the bubonic plague, also known as the Black Death, began in the 14th century. In just a few decades, this disease killed about a third of Europe's population. That's right, 1 in every 3 people. It's as if millions of people suddenly disappeared within months. Streets were filled with carts collecting bodies, entire cities were abandoned, and even doctors wearing those famous bird beak masks were more afraid than knowledgeable. And here's the curious part. Despite the horror, the Black Death also changed how the world worked. With so many people dying, labor in farms and cities became scarce, giving more power to peasants who were previously almost invisible. Some historians say that without the plague, Europe's major social changes might have taken centuries to occur. Now hold on to this. Some believed the disease was divine punishment, and crowds marched through the streets whipping themselves in hopes of warding off God's wrath. But the truth was hidden in something tiny, carried by fleas on rats. And if you think that was the only time a disease turned the world upside down, wait until you hear about the one that crossed oceans and nearly wiped out entire civilizations. Picture this scene: European ships arriving in the Americas in the 16th century. To the native peoples, those ships seemed to carry only adventurers and soldiers. But they brought something far more deadly. Diseases like smallpox, measles, and influenza crossed the ocean, hidden in the bodies of colonizers, and spread with devastating force. Within a few decades, entire civilizations, like the Aztecs and Incas, lost millions of people. Estimates suggest that up to 90% of the native population of the Americas perished, not from wars, but from viruses and bacteria against which they had no defense. It's as if an entire world was erased before it even had a chance to fight. What's most striking is how this changed the course of history. Without the demographic and military strength they once had, these incredibly rich empires became vulnerable to small groups of European conquerors. Hernán Cortés, for example, faced the mighty Aztec Empire with a tiny army. But smallpox was his true secret weapon. And here's a chilling detail. Many indigenous people believed the gods were angry, as entire families died without explanation. Meanwhile, for the conquerors, this tragedy seemed like divine proof that they were destined to dominate. Now take a deep breath, because the next case shows that even massive, well-structured empires can fall when a virus knocks at the door. And this time, it wasn't in the New World, but at the heart of the Roman Empire. 2nd century AD. The Roman Empire was at the height of its power, ruling territories from Britain to the Middle East. But then, an invisible enemy began to erode the foundations of this superpower, the so-called Antonine Plague. It all started when Roman soldiers returned from military campaigns in the East. They didn't bring back just gold and glory. They also brought a mysterious disease, likely smallpox that spread like wildfire. It's estimated that the plague killed millions of people, including Emperor Lucius Verus, and later, the philosopher Emperor Marcus Aurelius. Imagine living in Rome at that time, temples filled with desperate people, offerings to the gods multiplying, while doctors tried to explain symptoms that seemed almost magical: high fevers, skin eruptions, and sudden deaths. And the strangest part? No one knew exactly how to avoid it. This outbreak not only weakened the Roman army, which suddenly lost thousands of soldiers, but also shook the economy and faith in imperial power. Many historians believe the Antonine Plague was one of the first signs of Rome's fragility, centuries before its final fall. Here's a provocation. How often have you heard that great empires fall only due to invasions or wars? Well, sometimes what brings down giants isn't a sword, but a microscopic enemy no one can see. And if you found that striking, wait until you hear about the epidemic that made Constantinople tremble and left the future of all of Europe hanging by a thread. 6th century. The city of Constantinople was the heart of the Byzantine Empire, shining with palaces, churches, and trade that connected east and west. But in 541, something terrifying began to happen. An unknown disease invaded the streets, soon known as the Plague of Justinian. The accounts from that time are chilling. They say people who seemed perfectly healthy would suddenly fall ill with high fevers and painful swellings on their bodies. Many died within days. It's estimated that the plague killed up to 50 million people, almost half the known world's population at the time. Emperor Justinian, who gave the epidemic its name, contracted the disease but narrowly survived. Still, his empire would never be the same. The plague weakened the army, drastically reduced the economy, and left Constantinople vulnerable to external enemies. Some historians even argue that, without this tragedy, the Byzantine Empire might have reconquered much of the former Roman Empire. Here's a curious detail. This disease was caused by the same bacterium that centuries later would trigger the infamous Black Death in Europe. It's like a preview of the disaster yet to come. Now think about this. If an epidemic could halt the ambitions of one of history's most powerful empires, what about a disease that changed the fate of entire continents during the Age of Great Navigations? 16th century. The world was being reshaped by the Great Navigations. Portuguese and Spanish explorers crossed oceans in search of new routes and riches. But amid all this movement, a disease began to haunt sailors: scurvy. Imagine being on a ship for months eating only hardtack, salted meat, and no fresh fruit. Gradually, sailors' teeth would fall out, their gums would bleed, and their bodies would weaken, unable to fight infections. Many died slowly and painfully, with no one understanding why. The most intriguing thing is that the solution was incredibly simple: vitamin C. But back then, no one had any idea. Scurvy was responsible for more deaths at sea than naval battles themselves. It was as if an invisible enemy lurked on every voyage. And the impact was enormous. Entire expeditions failed, trade routes were delayed, and even the colonization of some regions was hindered. It was only centuries later that Europeans realized that citrus fruits like lemons and oranges could save lives. Fun fact: British sailors who started using lemons for prevention became known as limeys, a nickname still used to refer to the English today. Now, hold on to this. If scurvy tormented navigators, another disease became the constant shadow of armies and transformed entire wars. Let's talk about an enemy that crossed battlefields without ever carrying a sword. Typhus. 17th and 18th centuries. Picture great armies marching, uniforms aligned, flags waving. But suddenly soldiers start falling. Not from enemy swords, but from high fevers, chills, and skin rashes. That was typhus, a disease that spread rapidly in battlefields and overcrowded prisons. Typhus was transmitted by lice. Yes, those tiny insects that thrived in dirty clothes and exhausted soldiers. The result? Entire troops were decimated before even facing the enemy. During the 30 Years' War, for example, it's believed that more soldiers died from typhus than in direct combat. And here's a detail that changes everything. Typhus didn't pick sides. Both powerful armies and small rebel groups suffered equally. This turned wars into true lotteries, where victory didn't depend only on strategy or weapons, but on luck against a microscopic enemy. A striking scene occurred during Napoleon's campaigns in Russia. While cannons roared and winter froze soldiers, typhus attacked silently. It's estimated that hundreds of thousands of men succumbed, not to battles, but to the disease. It was as if nature itself had allied with the enemy. Now think about this. How many maps of Europe would look different if typhus hadn't swept through armies? That's right. Military history was often decided not on battlefields, but inside the human body. And if you found that shocking, wait until you see how a tropical fever helped build and nearly destroyed one of the greatest engineering feats in the world, the Panama Canal. Early 20th century, the United States took on the challenge of completing one of history's most ambitious projects, the Panama Canal. The promise was to connect the Atlantic to the Pacific, shortening maritime routes and transforming global trade. But there was an enemy hidden in the stagnant waters and swamps of the region: mosquitoes. These tiny insects transmitted two deadly diseases, malaria and yellow fever. Workers arrived healthy at the construction site and within days were bedridden with high fevers, chills, and often no chance of recovery. It's estimated that tens of thousands died before the situation was brought under control. Imagine the frustration. Engineers calculated bridges, tunnels, and locks, but what really decided the project's fate were invisible mosquitoes. It was like trying to build a skyscraper in the middle of a firestorm. It was only when doctors like Carlos Finley and William Gorgas identified the link between mosquitoes and diseases that the tide turned. They implemented sanitation measures, drained swamps, and spread oil on water to kill larvae. The result? Mortality rates plummeted, and the canal was finally completed in 1914. Here's a fascinating tidbit. Without this disease control, the canal might never have been built. In other words, modern global trade owes a lot to a battle against mosquitoes. But diseases didn't just delay grand projects. Some were so devastating that they put the entire world on alert. And none marked the 20th century as much as the so-called Spanish flu, the year 1918. The world had barely recovered from the shock of World War I when an even more treacherous enemy began to spread: the Spanish flu. Unlike common flus, this one came like a storm. Within months, it had reached every continent, striking big cities and isolated villages alike. It's estimated that a third of the world's population was infected. And the scariest part, unlike most flus, which mainly affect children and the elderly, this disease hit young, healthy adults with full force. Soldiers who had survived the war's trenches fell within days. Imagine the psychological impact. After years of battles, when peace finally arrived, humanity was caught off guard by a disease that killed silently. Hospitals overflowed, bodies piled up in churches, and even public transportation stopped because there weren't enough healthy drivers. Here's a chilling comparison. The Spanish flu killed more people in 2 years than World War I did in 4. That's right. An invisible enemy was deadlier than cannons, machine guns, and bombs combined. The most intriguing part is that, despite being so devastating, the flu ended up spurring medical research, encouraging governments to invest in public health and vaccines. It was as if humanity had received a wake-up call about the importance of science. But hold on, we've got one last stop on this journey. Let's talk about a disease that until a few decades ago was considered a death sentence, and that forever changed how we view medicine and human solidarity. I'm talking about AIDS. Late 20th century. As the world modernized with computers, the internet, and globalization, a new disease emerged like a ghost: AIDS. In the 1980s, little was known about it, and the impact was devastating. At first, HIV seemed like an unsolvable mystery. Young, seemingly healthy people began developing rare infections and strange tumors. Fear took over. There was a lot of prejudice, and for many, receiving a diagnosis was almost like hearing a death sentence. But the story doesn't end there. The AIDS epidemic also changed how science, politics, and society responded to diseases. Public pressure grew, organizations united, and doctors from various countries accelerated research for treatments. It was an unprecedented global effort. The result? Decades later, AIDS is no longer the fatal sentence it once was. Today, thanks to antiretroviral drugs, millions of people live with the virus and lead long, productive lives. And more. The fight against HIV paved the way for advances in genetic research, vaccines, and even how we approach other pandemics. Now stop and think. From medieval plagues to modern viruses, how many times has history been rewritten by invisible enemies? How many wars, kingdoms, and empires changed course because of something microscopic? If there's one thing these stories teach us, it's that humanity has always been in a constant dance with diseases, and every step of that dance has shaped the world we live in. So which of these diseases surprised you the most? Share in the comments, give a like if you enjoyed the journey, and subscribe to the channel to not miss the next mysteries of history and science.